Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. This week, the Conservative Party leader, David Cameron, and the leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, agreed that a referendum would take place in 2014 on Scottish independence. Among those eligible to vote will be those over the age of 16 years and 10 months on the day of the ballot. The move raises the prospect of extending the franchise to 16-year-olds in all elections throughout the United Kingdom. Or does it? Campaigners insist teenagers of the same age are permitted to work, marry and fight for their country. Will a vote for 16-year-olds force politicians to listen to young people more? But those against say teenagers do not have the maturity to make an informed vote. Are teenagers equipped to make these kinds of decisions on political parties, and what kind of effect would their vote have on the outcome at the ballot box, not just in the Scottish Independence Referendum that's coming up, but also in future elections across the United Kingdom? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mark Kidson. He's a trustee from the British Youth Council, and he's also from the group Votes at 16. Also in the studio here is Darren Hughes. He's Director of Campaigns and Research at the Electoral Reform Society. On the line, we have Dr. Jay Gidd, Chief of the Unit on Brain Imaging in Child Psychiatry Branch at the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland, United States. And also on the line is Sylvia Kritzinger, Head of the Department of Methods and Social Sciences at the University of Vienna. Thank you very much for joining me here on The Voice of Russia. This announcement this week, Mark Kidson, this is a clever move by Alex Salmond, isn't it? 16 and 17-year-olds are more likely to vote with their parents, and it's a boost for the referendum.
I'm not entirely sure you can see it quite as cynically as that. Nobody's entirely sure what way 16 and 17-year-olds who are enfranchised in this referendum will vote. I think there's still quite a long time until that particular ballot is held, and I think young people who get a clear signal that they are going to be involved in that conversation will be listening increasingly carefully at the arguments put by both sides. Scotland has a very active youth parliament. I'm sure it'll be something that will come up with young people involved in that, and I'm sure that their votes are up for grabs. I don't think it's a done deal for Alex Salmond.
Darren Hughes, does this mean that we're going to see politics enter the classroom? We're going to see teachers politicising in lessons? I mean, this can't be a particularly good move, can it?
Well, I hope it does lead to politics in the classroom, but maybe not as partisan as you suggest or hint at. I mean, I think what's really important here, as Mark says, there's a long way to go before the vote takes place. So the voters we're talking about are currently 14 and 15, which means that there's a real chance for the kind of civics education, voter information, these wider issues of democratic participation that can be addressed in the school system. And that gives us this chance now to talk more broadly about how we have more people involved in democracy, better understanding and longer length of time of their participation because they're starting early. So I know the political talk right now is about has Alex Salmond outfoxed David Cameron, all these kind of things that are part of the day-to-day of politics. But the broader issue here is about democratic participation and a chance for a real sense of civics to take hold. And I think that's an experiment certainly worth trying.
Jay Gidd, I'll turn to you in the United States there. Do you think 16 and 17-year-olds have the wherewithal, the ability to make a proper decision, an informed decision at the ballot box?
Certainly many do. They're probably not as good as they're going to get in terms of considering the longer-term implications of actions, but they are consistently surprise people at how well they do in terms of thinking through fairly complex issues. I certainly agree in terms of the educational aspects. It really engages the students of this age if they feel that their opinions will matter, and it could engage them at a very critical time in their development where they'll be much more active in the civic process for the rest of their lives. So I think that there are many implications of age of voting and age of competence for things like consenting to marriage, birth control, driving, and the neurobiology is just beginning to weigh in on some of these issues.
But you have said, Jay Gidd, that you have argued that in humans the frontal lobe only reaches maturity in their 20s. Now, that is that an argument against younger people from having the vote?
Well, a lot of the difficult decision-making occurs in peer pressure in times of high emotional conflict, and the voting process, if it is covered in school and the issues, should be more of a so-called cold cognition process, where it's not a spur-of-the-moment decision. They'll have time to learn about and weigh the different options. And in those domains, the 16-year-olds, with some exceptions, do quite well compared to adults. The trouble is that certain individuals will be very ready to do that at even younger ages, at 14, and many adults never achieve that sort of decision-making no matter how old they become.
I'd like to bring in Sylvia Kritzinger from the University of Vienna. You did a study, didn't you, on 16 and 17-year-olds and whether it was a good idea that they should be allowed to vote. And, of course, Austria itself is the only country within the European Union that has given the vote to 16-year-olds, and that was back in 2007. Can you just tell me a little bit about what your findings were?
Our findings were actually very positive. First of all, we could see that, yes, indeed, they do turn out a little bit less than older cohorts, but in the end, they are very interested in politics. They have a very good knowledge about political issues, and actually was very interesting to observe was that the quality of their vote choice was really good, in the sense that they really have chosen the party that is closest to them in terms of their ideology. So they were pretty aware of which party to vote for, and our findings actually tell us that there is absolutely no problem in lowering the voting age to 16. And what we actually have also found in another study is that if you give them the voting right at a very early stage, when they're still at school, living at home, talking to parents and friends about politics, then you can already see first tendencies that there is a certain habit of voting that can develop, in the sense that those actually voting the first time at the age of 16 and 17 are more likely to turn out 4 or 5 years later for the next election. So all in all, we have very positive findings.
But what about in Austria in general? I mean, what was the participation rate amongst that age group?
Well, it's a little bit lower than amongst the older cohorts. And here, when I talk about older cohorts, it means people above 30 years. But it's still around 70%.
But Mark Kidson, I guess what you'll have is a situation where, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, they may have a degree of apathy, but they're hardly going to be engaged with the political process at that age, are they? I mean, they're not paying taxes. They have less of a social contract with those who govern them. So they should wait a couple of years, shouldn't they?
No, not at all. I think many 16, 17-year-olds are paying taxes. You can leave a school at 16 in this country, get a full-time job. I had friends who I was at school with who have. So in that sense, taxation and representation perhaps is a strengthening argument for why we should have votes at 16. Through my work with the British Youth Council and the UK Youth Parliament, I've seen thousands of young people who are actively engaged in issues, in political processes. Over 1 million young people since the last election, in those 2.5 or so years, have voted locally for their local youth councillors, for their local MYPs to sit in the UK Youth Parliament. They have a sitting on the 23rd of November. And there is no sign that these young people are less engaged than many older people who are just as likely to either vote tribally and not engage with the arguments and the issues of politics, or not vote at all.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name's Brendan Cole. We're discussing, should 16 and 17-year-olds be given the vote? With me is Mark Kidson from the British Youth Council, Darren Hughes, who's Director of Campaigns and Research at the Electoral Reform Society. On the line, we have Sylvia Kritzinger, Head of the Department of Methods and Social Sciences at the University of Vienna, and Dr. Jay Gidd, Chief of the Unit on Brain Imaging in Child Psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. But they do, Darren Hughes, they do vote tribally, don't they? I mean, you're more likely to be swayed by the extremes of a political spectrum when you're younger. You are more likely to vote the way your parents vote. You're going to be highly influenced by peer pressure. You haven't been in the workforce. You haven't really got the life experience to make an informed choice, have you?
Well, I think there'll be some who fall into that category. But as I think Jay said earlier on, there's plenty of so-called grown-ups in their 30s and 40s who might fit into that bill as well. So I think that, of course, there are some risks, I guess, in extending the franchise. But you've got to weigh that up against what the benefits of it. And this is the first generation to come through secondary education with a proper civics education component to the curriculum. I was reading a blog during the week by Jackie Smith, who'd been the Minister of Education when the last Labor government introduced that particular component. So you've actually got a group who are coming through now who have understood these issues, have learnt about them, and what's attractive about the idea of votes at 16 is that you can have a seamless transition from learning about these issues to actually doing them, to exercising a vote. And we know that the lowest turnout of voters is amongst that 18 to 24 category. So anything we can do to try and boost participation early, that will have a positive flow-on effect as they grow older, because all the research says that if you start voting in your early adult life, that will lead through to a pattern of voting throughout your adult life. So we've got a big democratic challenge in the UK to get more people involved, more people participating, and this seems like a practical response to that particular issue.
Sylvia Kritzinger, is that correct, that the earlier you get involved in the political process through voting, the more likely you are to participate throughout your life?
The first findings that we got from our empirical data definitely show in this direction, that it's more likely that if you've turned out the first time when you're 16 and 17, still working, still being at school, still living with your parents, it's more likely that 4 or 5 years later you're more likely to turn out again. And we see here a major discrepancy between voters 16 and 17 years old and the voters 18 and 19 and 20 years old. So those voters who actually are not at school any longer or not living with their parents are much less likely to turn out 4 or 5 years later. So obviously, once you actually learn how to turn out to vote with your parents, with teachers telling you to go to the elections, it's more likely that this is an ongoing process for the rest of your life.
But Sylvia, surely the inverse is true as well. If you don't turn out to vote in that at that age of 16, you've got the apathy will entrench itself, and you're less likely to vote later on.
No, but the thing is that once you actually are, if you're only 16 and 17 years old, you're more likely to turn out, because there is, of course, this pressure by your parents, by your friends, but also by the teachers at school, which tell you, listen, there is an election coming up, you should actually turn out because this is your civic duty somehow to turn out. Then it's more likely that they turn out. Though, if you actually, in the first moment you get them to the ballot box, it's more likely that you will get them in the future as well.
Jay Gidd, you talking earlier on about the neuroscience of how brains develop and things, but is there any kind of evidence that the decisions you make at 16 or 17 will differ greatly to that of 21 or 22? Can 16-year-olds make a responsible choice?
Oh, definitely they can. And the primary task of a 16-year-old is to fit into society, to find mates, but also social alliances and partnerships. And so this is really a critical time for them to be engaged. And I think empowering them with this privilege really does give them the incentive to learn the issues, to feel that their opinions do matter. As a group, they will tend to be less conservative than older voters, and we may say, oh, that's the wrong decision or irrational, but from their perspective, it may be the logical choice in the sense that older people have the resources. They have, they don't want things to change, and if you're in the second decade of life, it's in your interest to want to change and to want things to be shaken up a bit. And so we may look at that as a irrational decision, or a fear that if we let 16-year-olds vote, that Justin Bieber would be president, or that they would just squander their vote. But all the evidence is that that's not the case. Well,
I actually think Justin Bieber is Canadian, but he certainly would be he certainly would be a key plank on any kind of electoral platform. But isn't that the danger, though, that at 16, 17-year-olds are quite idealistic. Politicians will have to almost not be true to themselves. You will have 50-year-old politicians trying to appeal to 16 and 17-year-olds, and they can be quite cynically manipulated, though, can't they?
But many of the issues politicians should be concerned with affect 16-year-olds, and many of whom can be parents and have a great stake in society, in the workplace. So I think that if politicians need to address the needs of 16-year-olds, that may ultimately be a good thing.
I think the other point there too is that we're not talking about having the vote only being exercised by 16 and 17-year-olds. So everyone over the age of 18 will continue to vote as well. And any politician who ridiculously targeted their campaign, trying to be hip with the teenagers, might find they're burning off a lot of support in older demographics who are saying, why are you trying to wrap your way through a campaign rather than conducting a sensible campaign across a broad range of demographics? So I think we've got to keep it in context. I mean, I take the point that there is a risk that you could get a wave of support for a certain candidate or a certain issue, that kind of peer pressure argument. I guess the only sign of caution, I think, reflects our voting system. But because we have first past the post, we have these small number of marginal seats where basically the entire election is conducted. And so if the margins of winning is very, very small, then a few hundred teenagers who go a certain way might have an impact. If we had a more proportional system of voting, then of course those voters would be subsumed into a much larger number of voters, and they'd have their say, but it wouldn't be a say out of whack or out of context. So the fear that 16 and 17-year-olds might have a disproportionate effect on an election because of their age is not really a fair criticism of those particular voters. It's more a criticism of the voting system we have, which does lead to these kind of unusual results.
I think it's important we don't sort of get hung up on the idea that politics is some search for the right answer, and that young people are somehow, so fueled up by their idealism that they're going more likely to get it wrong. Politics has always been, to some extent, about idealism, and actually having a broad range of views that represent stakes in our collective life is absolutely essential to getting not to the right answer, but to an answer that is just intergenerationally as well as correct for any given period.
And actually, your point before about tribal politics is just another form of peer pressure, really. I mean, I'm the ancient age now of 34, and I've voted for the same party every election I've had the chance to. I can't imagine not voting for the party that I support. Now, I suppose you could extrapolate that and say that's a form of peer pressure, that's a mixture of my upbringing, my views on life, so on and so forth. But it's not all that different to saying that a 16 or 17-year-old wouldn't look at the same issues and come to the same conclusion. So I think, no matter what age demographic you look at, there are pros and cons of them having the franchise. But actually, I think when it comes to votes at 16, it's far outweighed by the fact that this is a chance for that democratic participation, better voter information, and critically, a civics education that's got to make our democracy stronger.
Mark Kidson, your group Votes at 16 represents young people. How do you think they would view politicians in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and even older, trying to appeal to them? I mean, would they view them with cynicism? There might be a bit of a cringe factor in electoral campaigns, mightn't there?
I think, as Darren pointed out, that is always a danger, but politicians are as likely to lose support by going down some of those more cringeworthy routes than to gain it. You've got examples like that already, because 18 to 24-year-olds actually, in some of their tastes and in their difference to a 50-year-old politician, are not that much narrower in the gap than the 16 and 17-year-olds would be. I do think you would start to see a little bit more of a shift in the demographic. We're already getting younger politicians anyway, and we could debate the merits of that separately. But young people being more actively involved as representatives, not just as sort of passive recipients of political messages, is something that we might see a bit more of, and we actually might see a broader range of young people getting involved politically at that younger age, rather than often only those who defer until they get to university and join a debating club or whatever. Actually, that transition that was mentioned before from civics education, citizenship education at school, through to more active forms of political participation. And let's keep in mind that democratic politics, is a practical, not an intellectual pursuit. That's why these comments about the habit of voting are so important, because it's as much about feeling invested in your community and feeling like you've got a part to play as it is about getting to the right answer when scrutinising the arguments of parties.
Sylvia Kritzinger at the University of Vienna, the study that you carried out was in Austria, of course, which has a more proportional system than we have here in the UK, which is really fought on swing seats and has a first past the post system. So the kind of representation that's giving younger people the vote may not work in the UK in the way that it does in Austria. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, of course, they are more proportional because there is a wider range of parties you can choose from. But I just wanted to add to the discussion that was going on before, that young voters actually do choose the party which is closest to them in ideological terms, and that's really important. So it's not like that they follow the peer pressure, saying, okay, as my friends and my family and whoever else is going to vote for a certain candidate for a certain party, I'm going to do the same thing. No, they are pretty aware of where they stand in ideological terms and choose the party which actually represents the ideology closest to them. So in that respect, there is absolutely no danger that the quality of vote choice would be somehow worse once you actually give the voting rights to 16 and 17 years old ones. And based on this ideological distribution on a left-right dimension, it's also possible that the different views of young voters are actually represented in the parliament as well, given also the fact that there are quite a lot of different parties in Austria compared to the British system.
Jay Gidd in Maryland, is there much of a movement there for the franchise being extended to younger voters?
In some ways. I mean, a lot of the arguments seem to parallel the concerns brought up with the women's right to vote, and in the U.S. it moved in 1972 from age 21 to 18 on the argument that if you're old enough to die in Vietnam, you should be old enough to vote. But in the U.S., it hasn't been focused so much on voting age as recently the death penalty in the judicial system, the right to make decisions in terms of marriage and reproduction on your own behalf. Can you get birth control pills without your parents' consent when you're 17? But the voting age part hasn't been a very forceful movement in terms of voting, more so in the age in which you can hold public office, which is quite inconsistent, being 35 for president, 30 for Senate, 25 for House, 21 for governor. So our society hasn't come up with a crisp age at which the brain is mature enough to fend for itself.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia. We're discussing, should 16 and 17-year-olds be given the vote? With Mark Kidson, Sylvia Kritzinger, Dr. Jay Gidd and Darren Hughes. Doesn't that simply reflect that people of that age have more of a stake in society, and so logically that would extend to voting rights, wouldn't it?
Correct. Yes, and I think that's where a lot of the debate comes in, and how much life experience is necessary, and is life experience only a matter of your birth date, or is it your actual circumstances in life?
So politicians need life experience, but voters don't.
Correct. Yeah, that would be I think a logical but shaky conclusion from the current policies.
It's not completely illogical in the sense that we have a representative system of democracy, and we elect people to make decisions on our behalf. So if the average representative is older than the average voter, that's not necessarily a problem, because we don't have a form of direct democracy where 16 and 17-year-olds would be deciding the issues of the day. In the Scottish case, we have got a particular example, but that is an example of an issue that will determine their future and the choices they make in their future for decades, if not for the rest of their lives. So I think it's not inconsistent to say that your average representative would want to have more life experience, and that's probably always going to be the case. But that does not sort of map onto the voter's need for life experience, because actually young people have life experience. They experience the education system in the way that a 60-year-old almost certainly doesn't. They experience all sorts of interactions with society. Public transport is an issue that comes up all the time for people involved in the British Youth Council. Child poverty is something that we know our members have huge and very deeply held views on. So I don't think it's as easy to say that young people don't have the required life experience to make political judgments.
Darren Hughes from the Electoral Reform Society. So we could see 16, 17-year-olds vote, but would you like to see 16 and 17-year-old political representatives? or representing that demographic?
Well, I think that's entirely a choice for voters. Voters get to look at a slate of candidates and make a judgment about whether or not they're ready for office, ready to serve, ready to represent. And I mean, I think it's very unlikely that someone aged 16 would win a constituency seat in the House of Commons. It's almost impossible to believe they'd be appointed to the House of Lords either. Although with that institution, who knows? While I think it's very unlikely that someone would be elected, I think no matter what age a candidate stands, voters look at it and they want to see whether that candidate has empathy, understanding, experience, ability, and they'll weigh up all those things before they cast their vote. So, I'm sure we can all think of politicians we know of who were in their 30s and we thought were fantastic, and those who were maybe in their 50s who we didn't think so much of, and vice versa. So I'm pretty relaxed about that, because I trust that voters will weigh up all those things. I think just coming back to this point about the Scottish referendum, because that has really kick-started off the discussion, and it's worthwhile us thinking about what is being proposed there. The Prime Minister and the government have ruled out effectively lowering the voting age for the next general election in 2015, but they've given consent to 16 and 17-year-olds deciding the future of the Union, which I would have thought is a much bigger, long-lasting and important decision at that referendum in 2014 than who happens to form government after 2015. So although of course voting for your representative is always an important thing, an individual general election is way overshadowed by the importance of this referendum. And I think that having opened the door to this to say that the future of the United Kingdom is important to so many people that even 16 and 17-year-olds get a say in it, I think now it's very hard to argue that shouldn't apply for regular general elections.
Do you see it that way, Mark Kidson? Do you see this as the door's been opened for the argument? Effectively, we're going to see a large-scale experiment in 2014 as to participation amongst that age group.
I think it's very difficult to see how you argue consistently against that position. You introduced the segment with some examples of things that young people can do at the age of 16 and 17, that society decides that they are able to make those judgments. Another one that you didn't mention is, in this country, you can be a company director at the age of 16. So, that's a pretty big decision, and I think we've seen plenty of companies that look like they're run by sort of less responsible adults. So in that case, and as Darren was saying, once you've opened the door for a voters' major as the vote on the future of the Union, how you try and then close it to young people when deciding who should represent them in Parliament, I just think you'll be on very, very thin ice indeed.
And Darren Hughes, from a practical level, how would this play out post-2014 or post the 2015 general election? It would need a debate in the House of Commons, wouldn't it? It would need to, and we're going to have another thing go to the country, which perhaps there might not be quite the appetite for.
It would have to be legislation to change the age of eligibility for voting. There's legislation going through right now, actually, about the way that people join the electoral register. So there is an opportunity if the government wanted to take it. But I think that there's been a reluctance on their part to signal that. I'm not sure that. I think you mean, would there be a referendum of the public on whether or not to lower the age? I don't think that would be necessary. But I think that the politicians are going to have to look at what happens at 2014 and then to see whether or not they are actually able to make a logical case that, having opened the door, they're going to close it again and say that younger voters shouldn't get the chance to participate. I just think, having let the genie out of the bottle, there's now an amazing opportunity for us to take this civic education and see whether it does change to having more people engaged in voting, which is a critical problem in the UK. Every general election we're seeing fewer and fewer people wanting to vote, fewer and fewer people being interested, and by extending the franchise, we might be able to turn around that sorry situation.
We've run out of time, but I'd just like to thank my guests, Darren Hughes, Director of Campaigns and Research at the Electoral Reform Society, Mark Kidson, Trustee with the British Youth Council, and from the group Votes at 16. On the line, Sylvia Kritzinger, Head of the Department of Methods and Social Sciences at the University of Vienna, and Dr. Jay Gidd, Chief of the Unit on Brain Imaging and Child Psychiatry at the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland, the United States. Thank you very much for joining me on The Voice of Russia. On the line is Sylvia Kritzinger, head of the Department of Methods and Social Sciences at the University of Vienna. Thank you very much for joining me here on The Voice of Russia. This announcement this week, Mark Kidson, this is a clever move by Alex Salmond, isn't it? 16 and 17-year-olds are more likely to vote with their parents, and it's a boost for the referendum.
I'm not entirely sure you can see it quite as cynically as that. Nobody's entirely sure what way 16 and 17-year-olds who are enfranchised in this referendum will vote. I think there's still quite a long time until that particular ballot is held, and I think young people who get a clear signal that they are going to be involved in that conversation will be listening increasingly carefully at the arguments put by both sides. Scotland has a very active youth parliament, I'm sure.
Right for their country. Will a vote for 16-year-olds force politicians to listen to young people more? But those against say teenagers do not have the maturity to make an informed vote. Are teenagers equipped to make these kinds of decisions on political parties, and what kind of effect would their vote have on the outcome at the ballot box, not just in the Scottish Independence Referendum that's coming up, but also in future elections across the United Kingdom? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mark Kidson. He's a trustee from the British Youth Council, and he's also from the group Votes at 16. Also in the studio here is Darren Hughes. He's Director of Campaigns and Research at the Electoral Reform Society. On the line, we have Dr. Jay Gidd, Chief of the Unit on Brain Imaging in Child Psychiatry Branch at the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland, United States. And also
that can be addressed in the school system. And that gives us this chance now to talk more broadly about how we have more people involved in democracy, better understanding and longer length of time of their participation because they're starting early. So I know the political talk right now is about has Alex Salmond outfoxed David Cameron, all these kind of things that are part of the day-to-day of politics. But the broader issue here is about democratic participation and a chance for a real sense of civics to take hold. And I think that's an experiment certainly worth trying.
Jay Gidd, I'll turn to you in the United States there. Do you think 16 and 17-year-olds have the wherewithal, the ability to make a proper decision, an informed decision at the ballot box?
It'll be something that will come up with young people involved in that, and I'm sure that their votes are up for grabs. I don't think it's a done deal for Alex Salmond.
Darren Hughes, does this mean that we're going to see politics enter the classroom? We're going to see teachers politicising in lessons? I mean, this can't be a particularly good move, can it?
Well, I hope it does lead to politics in the classroom, but maybe not as partisan as you suggest or hint at. I mean, I think what's really important here, as Mark says, there's a long way to go before the vote takes place. So the voters we're talking about are currently 14 and 15, which means that there's a real chance for the kind of civics education, voter information, these wider issues of democratic participation.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. This week, the Conservative Party leader, David Cameron, and the leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, agreed that a referendum would take place in 2014 on Scottish independence. Among those eligible to vote will be those over the age of 16 years and 10 months on the day of the ballot. The move raises the prospect of extending the franchise to 16-year-olds in all elections throughout the United Kingdom. Or does it? Campaigners insist teenagers of the same age are permitted to work, marry and